Close your eyes for a moment and let yourself settle in. Tonight, we're going to travel together through stories that most history books never tell. Stories written not with swords or speeches, but with ink on paper, in the quiet hours when the world held its breath. These are tales of letters that stopped wars, of gentle words that moved mountains, of ordinary people who chose their pen over their pride and changed everything. Picture, if you will, a world where the most powerful weapon isn't forged in fire, but folded carefully into an envelope. Where a single sheet of paper, creased at the edges and stained by anxious fingers, can disarm whole armies. This is the world we'll explore together, a place where patience triumphs over panic, where understanding blooms in the spaces between enemies. In the chapters ahead, we'll meet a Soviet leader writing by candlelight to an American president, both fathers fearing for their children's tomorrow. We'll sit beside a lonely scientist who walked away from building bombs to build bridges instead. We'll witness love letters that birthed peace prizes, and secret diplomats who saved lives from the shadows of cathedrals. These stories unfold like petals opening slowly in moonlight, each one revealing something beautiful about the human heart's capacity to choose hope over hatred. They remind us that behind every great turning point in history, there's often someone sitting at a desk, choosing their words as carefully as a gardener tends their roses. So let yourself sink deeper into comfort, dear listener. Let the weight of the day fall away. We have time, all the time in the world, to discover how letters became lifelines, how conversations conducted in whispers across continents prevented the world from screaming. Tonight, we celebrate the quiet victories, the gentle revolutionaries, the peace that came not with trumpets, but with the soft scratch of pen on paper. October 1962. Autumn leaves drift past the windows of the White House as President John F. Kennedy sits in the Oval Office, holding a letter that arrived just hours ago from Moscow. The paper feels ordinary in his hands, crisp, official, bearing the seal of the Kremlin. But the words written upon it are anything but ordinary. They might just prevent the end of the world. Halfway across the globe in a dacha surrounded by birch trees outside Moscow, Nikita Khrushchev paces his study. The hour is well past midnight, but sleep feels impossible. Nuclear missiles sit in Cuban soil like buried secrets, and American warships circle the island like wolves. The world has never been closer to destroying itself, and somehow it falls to these two men, strangers who have never met, to pull it back from the brink. Khrushchev calls for his secretary and begins to dictate, not the formal language of diplomacy, but something far more dangerous, the truth. "Mr. President," he begins, his voice soft in the lamplight, "we and you ought not now to pull on the ends of the rope. For if we do, a moment may come when that knot will tighten, so that even he who tied it will not have the strength to untie it." Imagine that moment, a powerful man admitting fear, reaching across an ocean of mistrust with nothing but honesty. In his words, Kennedy hears not the voice of an enemy, but of a father who, like himself, has children sleeping in their beds. The letter transforms the crisis from a chess game between superpowers into a conversation between human beings who share the same fragile planet. But this letter is just the first of 13 that will pass between these two leaders over the next crucial days. Each one written in the small hours, each one carrying the weight of millions of lives. In Washington, Kennedy's advisors urge him to ignore Khrushchev's softer words and respond only to the harsher radio messages from Moscow. Instead, the president chooses to write back to the man, not the ideology. Picture John F. Kennedy at his desk at 1 in the morning. His usual eloquence reduced to something simpler, more essential. His ghostwriter, Ted Sorensen, helps him craft words that promise hope, a pledge that if the missiles leave Cuba, America will never invade the island. It's an offer that exists only on paper, never spoken from any podium. A secret shared between former enemies who are becoming something else entirely. Meanwhile, in Havana, Fidel Castro writes his own letter, a message urging Soviet first strike if American troops should land. The irony hangs heavy in the Caribbean air while two leaders write of peace. A third pens words of mutual destruction. The world balances on the edge of these competing narratives, these different visions of tomorrow written in the same precious ink. As October 27th dawns, Black Saturday they'll call it later, an American spy plane falls from Cuban skies. In the cabinet room, advisors speak of airstrikes and invasion plans. But in the quiet of the Oval Office, Kennedy clings to Khrushchev's letters like a lifeline. He sends his brother Robert to meet secretly with the Soviet ambassador, carrying America's acceptance, not through official channels, but hand to hand, human to human. In Moscow, Khrushchev reads Kennedy's response aloud to his aides, his voice carrying relief like a prayer answered. The American president has chosen to see him as a man, not a monster. Within hours, Radio Moscow broadcasts the Soviet leader's acceptance, ending the crisis before his own generals can object. 13 letters, some typed, some handwritten, all of them honest, have saved the world from itself. But the story doesn't end with the missiles leaving Cuba. 20 more letters passed between Kennedy and Khrushchev in the following weeks, messages of regret and relief, of lessons learned and friendships cautiously begun. These letters, never meant for public eyes, become a manual for future leaders facing similar crossroads. They prove that sometimes the most powerful diplomacy happens not in grand halls, but in the intimate space between one human heart and another, connected by nothing more than ink and understanding. In the summer of 1944, a young physicist named Joseph Rotblat makes a decision that will echo through history. Walking away from Los Alamos, where brilliant minds race to build the world's first atomic bomb, he cannot bear to continue once he learns that Germany, their original target, has no nuclear program. The bomb they're creating will fall on other cities, other families, other children. So he packs his few belongings and leaves behind the most important scientific project of his generation. Picture Rotblat returning to a London still scarred by the Blitz, carrying with him the terrible knowledge of what humanity has learned to do to itself. He sits in his modest flat, writing letters to fellow scientists scattered across a war-torn world. His words are simple but urgent. We who have unlocked these secrets must now find a way to lock them away from war. Bertrand Russell receives one such letter in 1955, and it sparks something extraordinary. The philosopher drafts what will become known as the Russell-Einstein Manifesto, a document warning that nuclear fallout may put an end to the human race. Einstein signs it just days before his death, his trembling signature the last political act of the century's greatest mind. The manifesto travels the world not through diplomatic pouches, but in the careful hands of scientists who believe that knowledge carries responsibility. In Nova Scotia, a wealthy industrialist named Cyrus Eaton reads the manifesto and makes an unlikely decision. He invites 22 of the world's leading scientists to his hometown of Pugwash, a tiny fishing village that smells of salt air and possibility. This is 1957, the height of the Cold War, when American and Soviet scientists aren't supposed to speak to each other, let alone share meals and worry together about humanity's future. Imagine Soviet physicist Dmitry Skobeltsyn riding a freight train across Poland, hiding diagrams of isotopic decay in his coat, terrified of being arrested as a spy. Meanwhile, American chemist Linus Pauling packs his bags knowing that FBI agents will follow him, recording every word he speaks. Yet they come anyway, these brave minds, drawn by something stronger than fear, the belief that science belongs to all humanity, not to any one flag or ideology. In Eaton's Cedar Lodge, with the Atlantic whispering outside the windows, something magical happens. Pauling and Milenshchikov argue passionately about fallout data, their voices rising and falling like the tide. FBI wiretaps capture their heated discussion of cloud chambers, agents certain they're listening to espionage when they're actually witnessing the birth of cooperation. From these conversations emerges something precious, agreement on defining a test ban verification threshold, words that will later appear almost verbatim in the partial test ban treaty of 1963. Rotblat watches these exchanges with wonder. Here, in this simple village, enemies are becoming colleagues, competitors becoming conspirators in the cause of peace. He writes a confidential memorandum proposing that nuclear weapon states pledge no first use, words dismissed in Washington, but quietly circulated in Beijing, eventually influencing China's historic no first use declaration of 1964. A letter rejected in one capital becomes policy in another. Ideas, like seeds, find unexpected soil in which to grow. The Pugwash meetings continue year after year, even as the Cold War deepens. Scientists smuggle letters across borders, hiding peace proposals in academic journals, turning conference halls into secret diplomatic channels. They create a shadow network of understanding that governments can't control, a web of relationships built on shared knowledge and common humanity. By 1995, half a century after Hiroshima cast its terrible shadow, Joseph Rotblat and the Pugwash conferences share the Nobel Peace Prize. The young physicist who walked away from building bombs has become an old man honored for building bridges. In his acceptance speech, his voice carries both triumph and heartbreak as he reminds the world, "Remember your humanity and forget the rest." His journey from Los Alamos to Stockholm proves something beautiful about the power of conscience and correspondence. Sometimes the greatest victories come not from completing the work, but from having the courage to walk away. Sometimes the most important letters are the ones that say no to destruction and yes to hope. In Rotblat's story, we see that science without conscience is meaningless, but conscience armed with knowledge can change the world, one letter at a time. Vienna, 1875. In the classified section of Die Presse, a curious advertisement appears. Wealthy gentleman seeks housekeeper versed in languages. The gentleman is Alfred Nobel, inventor of dynamite, lonelier than his fortune would suggest. The woman who answers is Countess Bertha Kinsky, aristocratic but impoverished, desperate enough to consider domestic work. Their meeting lasts barely a week before she elopes with Baron Arthur von Suttner, but in those few days, a friendship begins that will outlast empires. Picture the letters that follow. Thick envelopes carried by mail coaches through alpine passes, bearing the intimate thoughts of two souls who couldn't be more different. He, the merchant of destruction, growing wealthy from humanity's appetite for war. She, the countess turned peace activist, horrified by the very inventions that fund her friend's correspondence. Yet in their letters, they find something neither expected, understanding. Nobel writes from his villa in San Remo, Italy, in January 1893, his words careful but revealing, "I am considering a prize for him or her who shall have done the most for fraternity between nations." It's an idea born from their correspondence, from Bertha's gentle insistence that his wealth could serve something greater than profit. Her reply from Paris is swift and certain. "Make it peace, Alfred, not merely fraternity. The world needs to hear that word, peace, spoken with your authority." Bertha has been writing her own kind of revolution. Her novel, Lay Down Your Arms, spreads across Europe like wildfire, each chapter a testimony against the glory of war. She sends Nobel the first copy, and he reads it by lamplight, making notes in Swedish along the margins. His marginalia reveals a man calculating, not profits this time, but the human cost of his inventions. Tonnage of TNT versus casualties described in her pages. A scientist's mind grappling with a conscience awakening. The friendship deepens through ink and understanding. When the Petrovka factory explosion kills dozens in 1896, Nobel's letter to Bertha carries the weight of guilt. "I am the merchant of death, dear friend. Perhaps a prize can buy me absolution." Her response is gentle but firm. "Peace cannot be purchased, Alfred. It can only be incentivized by celebrating those who choose love over fear, understanding over anger." Those words plant a seed that blooms in Nobel's final testament, signed just months before his death. 5 prizes for human achievement, but the one dearest to his heart, the Peace Prize, born from a friendship conducted entirely in letters. A lonely inventor and a passionate countess, separated by borders and beliefs, but united by the revolutionary idea that humanity deserves better than eternal war. When Bertha von Suttner becomes the first woman to receive the Nobel Peace Prize in 1905, her acceptance speech quotes directly from Alfred's letters, their private correspondence becoming public testimony to the power of friendship across difference. She speaks of him not as the world knew him, but as she had come to know him through their letters, a man haunted by his legacy, seeking redemption through generosity. Their story reminds us that love takes many forms. Sometimes it's the passionate romance of poets, but sometimes it's the deeper current that flows between minds that challenge each other to be better. In every letter they exchanged, Nobel and Suttner were falling in love, not with each other, but with the possibility of a world transformed by understanding. Standing at the podium in Stockholm, Bertha holds the medal that bears Alfred's image and remembers their correspondence. Hundreds of letters that began with loneliness and ended with legacy. Their friendship, conducted across distance and difference, proves that sometimes the most powerful diplomacy happens not between nations, but between individual hearts brave enough to reach across the divide and say, "I see you, I hear you. Let us build something beautiful together." In their letters, preserved now in archives across Europe, we see the intimate blueprint of the Peace Prize, not as a political gesture, but as a love letter to humanity's potential. Two lonely souls who found in each other not romance, but something rarer, the courage to believe that even merchants of death can become architects of peace, one letter at a time. Ralph Bunche was born in Detroit to a barber and a freedwoman, raised by his grandmother after his parents died young. Nothing in his humble beginnings suggested he would one day stand at the center of history, holding the fate of nations in his gentle hands. Yet in 1948, as the newborn state of Israel and its Arab neighbors teeter on the brink of endless war, this soft, spoken scholar from Harvard finds himself in the most unlikely role of his life, peacemaker to a region that has forgotten how to hope. The story begins with tragedy. Count Folke Bernadotte, the Swedish diplomat appointed by the United Nations to mediate the conflict, rides through Jerusalem in his white sedan, marked with UN flags and the naive belief that neutrality might offer protection. On September 17th, disguised gunmen stop his convoy. Within moments, both Bernadotte and French observer André Serrault lie dead in the dusty street, their blood mixing with the ancient stones of the holy city. Bunch receives the news in his hotel room, the words crackling over a temperamental radio. He sits for a long moment in the gathering dusk, understanding that everything has changed. The telegram he drafts to UN headquarters in New York is simple but heavy with sorrow. Count Bernadotte and Colonel Serrault killed this afternoon. Proceeding with mission. After sending it, he allows himself 2 hours of sleep before stepping into the role that will define his life. The negotiations move to Rhodes, that ancient island where crusaders once planned their holy wars. The Palace Hotel ballroom becomes an unlikely peace chamber, but even choosing where to sit proves explosive. Egyptian Colonel Mohammed Fawzi refuses to negotiate beneath a chandelier he claims was looted from Cairo by crusaders centuries ago. Israeli delegate Walter Eitan demands kosher meals in a country where such concepts are foreign. The smallest details threaten to derail talks before they begin. Bunch, this gentle man from Detroit, finds solutions in kindness. He rotates the seating arrangement daily, so neither side feels diminished. He organizes midnight screenings of The Three Musketeers, hoping that shared laughter in a darkened room might soften hearts hardened by war. Slowly, carefully, he transforms enemies into negotiating partners, creating a space where impossible conversations become possible. Picture him at his typewriter in the early hours of dawn, crafting Article 2 of what will become the Armistice Agreement. "There shall be no hostile act," he types, borrowing language from old League of Nations documents, but adding his own crucial phrase, "between any forces, regular or irregular." Those few words, born of his legal training and human insight, anticipate the guerrilla conflicts of the future, providing a framework that will serve peacekeepers for decades to come. The negotiations stretch on for months. Bunch loses weight, his hair grays, his hands shake from exhaustion and endless cups of coffee. But gradually, miraculously, the pieces of peace begin to fit together. When his typewriter ribbon snaps during the final draft, he finishes the most important paragraphs by fountain pen, his handwriting becoming part of the historical record, a reminder that even in our mechanical age, the most crucial words are still written by human hands. The moment arrives at last. As the final signatures dry on the Rhodes Agreement, Bunch walks to the hotel's telegraph office and sends a Western Union message to his mother in Washington. "Done. Home soon." 5 words that summarize months of heartbreak and hope, sleepless nights and small miracles, the grinding work of turning enemies into neighbors. The Rhodes Agreement becomes the first UN-brokered peace accord between Israel and its Arab neighbors, a template for future negotiations. More personally, it earns Ralph Bunche the 1950 Nobel Peace Prize, the first awarded to a black laureate, recognition not just of his diplomatic skill, but of his profound humanity. In his acceptance speech, he speaks not of victory but of responsibility. Peace is not a reward for the righteous, but a necessity for the living. Bunche's story reminds us that the greatest diplomats are often those who understand suffering intimately, not from books or briefings, but from their own lives. A man who grew up poor and black in America, who knew what it meant to be dismissed and underestimated, brought that understanding to a negotiating table where both sides felt unheard and unvalued. His greatest weapon wasn't authority or wealth, it was empathy, the ability to see the humanity in everyone, even sworn enemies sitting across from each other in a hotel ballroom on an island where history had seen too much blood. In the end, what saved those negotiations wasn't clever legal language or political pressure. It was one man's refusal to give up on the possibility that people who had been killing each other could learn to live together. One man's faith that even the deepest hatred could be dissolved by patient understanding, one careful word at a time. In the heart of Rome, where ancient stones whisper of empires risen and fallen, stands a palace that has outlasted them all. The Vatican, smallest nation on earth, yet perhaps the most influential when it comes to the quiet art of making peace. Here, in rooms lined with Renaissance frescoes, some of history's most delicate negotiations have unfolded, not with fanfare or headlines, but in the gentle language of pastoral care extended to a wounded world. The tradition begins with Cardinal Pietro Gasparri in 1929, exchanging clandestine letters with Mussolini's representatives to secure Vatican sovereignty through the Lateran Treaty. But the real flowering of Vatican diplomacy comes decades later, in a working-class neighborhood called Trastevere, where a small Catholic community gathers each evening for prayer in the Church of Sant'Egidio. Andrea Riccardi, a university professor with kind eyes and infinite patience, leads these evening prayers. But by day, his modest apartment becomes an unlikely nerve center for peace negotiations. In 1990, two men arrive at his door, representatives of the warring factions in Mozambique's civil war. They slide rifle bullets across his marble table like poker chips, each one representing a village burned, a family destroyed. Guarantee us exile, they demand, or we return to killing. Riccardi drafts what he calls a pledge of silence, an informal agreement that both Frelimo and Renamo will halt their hostile propaganda while talks continue. It's written not on official letterhead but on simple notebook paper, signed with fountain pens borrowed from his desk drawer. The informality becomes its strength. Without the weight of state protocol, both sides can claim they haven't compromised their positions while they explore the possibility of peace. Picture the letters that follow, 220 handwritten notes exchanged over 27 months, each one smuggled past airport security guards hidden inside hymnals and prayer books. These aren't diplomatic cables drafted by foreign ministries. They're personal appeals from one human being to another. Renamo leader Afonso Dhlakama writes, "We have buried enough sons, let this letter be their resurrection." The emotional honesty cuts through decades of ideology and suspicion. The community of Sant'Egidio becomes known as the United Nations of Trastevere. their modest meeting room hosting secret negotiations that official diplomats cannot touch. Riccardi and his colleagues offer something governments cannot: moral neutrality combined with infinite patience. They serve espresso to guerrilla commanders and government ministers alike, creating a space where former enemies can discover they share the same fears, the same hopes for their children's future. The breakthrough comes not in grand speeches, but in small moments. A Renamo commander mentions his daughter's first communion. A Frelimo official shares photographs of his grandson. These glimpses of shared humanity, preserved in the margins of their correspondence, prove more powerful than any treaty clause. The 1992 Rome General Peace Accords end one of Africa's most brutal civil wars, but the model spreads. Vatican mediators, working from borrowed offices and funded by small donations, become peacemakers in conflicts from Algeria to South Sudan. They succeed where superpowers fail because they offer something unique: the ancient Christian promise that every human being, no matter how far they've fallen, deserves redemption. In 2024, as war returns to Europe with the conflict in Ukraine, the Vatican revives its back-channel diplomacy. The Pope dispatches what he calls a white flag letter to both Kyiv and Moscow, proposing ceasefire corridors for humanitarian aid. The language, leaked to Italian newspapers, echoes Bernadotte's 1948 proposals, proof that Vatican diplomats study their predecessors' correspondence, learning from both successes and failures. The power of Vatican diplomacy lies not in temporal authority. The Pope commands no armies, controls no oil reserves, but in moral authority earned through 2 millennia of caring for the world's wounded. When a cardinal writes to a warlord, he writes not as a representative of Italian interests or European policy, but as a pastor concerned for his flock, which includes everyone, victims and perpetrators alike. In the archives beneath St. Peter's Basilica, preserved in climate-controlled vaults, lie thousands of such letters. Correspondence between popes and presidents, cardinals and commanders, monks and ministers, each one a small miracle of reaching across the divide, of choosing dialogue over damnation. Together, they form perhaps history's most extensive collection of peace correspondence, proof that sometimes the most powerful diplomacy comes not from the mighty, but from those who speak for the meek. These letters remind us that peace is not merely the absence of war, but the presence of justice tempered by mercy. They show us that sometimes the most effective mediators are those who answer to a higher authority than any earthly power. Those who believe that every human heart, no matter how hardened by conflict, still contains a spark of divine love, waiting to be rekindled by the right words, written with the right intention, at exactly the right moment. In the spring of 1992, something extraordinary begins in a borrowed cottage near Trondheim, so quietly that even the CIA and Mossad don't notice. 2 men who should be enemies, Israeli sociologist Yair Hirschfeld and PLO finance official Ahmed Corey, sit across from each other at a simple wooden table, sharing coffee and the radical idea that perhaps their peoples don't have to hate each other forever. The cottage belongs to the Norwegian government, but Norway's foreign ministry has given strict instructions: no formal records, no official minutes, no diplomatic recognition that these conversations are even happening. Instead, the participants jot notes on yellow legal pads, creating what they playfully call lemon letters, informal talking papers that carry none of the weight of treaties but all the hope of breakthrough. Diplomat Mona Juul and her academic husband Terje Rod Larsen serve as hosts and guardians of this fragile process. Juul insists on something revolutionary: that everyone use first names only. No titles, no honorifics, no Your Excellency or Mr. Minister, just Yair and Abu Allah, two men discovering they both worry about their children's futures, both dream of peace for their grandchildren. When an Israeli security guard addresses Cray as Mr., Hirschfeld gently corrects him, reinforcing the informal covenant that equal respect might succeed where diplomatic hierarchy has failed. Picture these secret sessions stretching through the long Nordic summer, with light lingering until nearly midnight. The men walk along fjords where Vikings once launched their longships, finding in Norway's ancient neutrality a space where impossible conversations become possible. They argue passionately about borders and settlements, refugees and recognition, but they do so as Yair and Abu Allah, not as representatives of nations that have been killing each other for decades. The breakthrough comes not in a grand moment, but in accumulated trust, built through months of shared meals and honest talk. These men begin to understand that they want the same things: security for their families, dignity for their nations, hope for their children. The yellow pad notes multiply, filled with sketches of mutual recognition, frameworks for limited autonomy, dreams of tourism and trade replacing tanks and terrorism. After 14 secret sessions, Jules sits at a government IBM Selectric typewriter and transforms their yellow pad dreams into a 7-page declaration of principles. She works alone in her Oslo office, the only sound the rhythmic clicking of keys and the whisper of paper advancing line by line. When finished, she places the document in a diplomatic pouch labeled "Fish Recipes" to mislead any State Department clerks who might be curious about communications from Norway. The DOP travels to Stockholm for neutral legal review, but Jules deliberately leaves no carbon copy in Oslo. This precious document exists in only one form, making it seem as fragile and valuable as the peace it represents. Critics will later call it amateurish, full of loopholes and vague language. But that very informality becomes its strength. Both sides can claim authorship. Both can see their dreams reflected in its careful phrases. By August 1993, the secret is ready to become public. Secretary of State Warren Christopher receives the declaration in Washington, initially skeptical that anything useful could emerge from what he privately calls Norwegian meddling. But as he reads Jules' careful prose, he recognizes something authentic, not the polished language of diplomacy, but the honest words of people who have decided to trust each other. September 13th, 1993. The world watches in amazement as Yitzhak Rabin and Yasser Arafat shake hands on the White House lawn, with President Clinton beaming between them like a proud father. The Oslo Accords become front-page news around the globe, hailed as a breakthrough that seemed impossible just months before. But in the crowd that day stands Mona Juul, her handbag containing the original yellow legal pad where this entire process began. Pages covered with coffee stains and crossed-out words, arrows pointing to compromises, question marks beside the hardest issues. She keeps it close as a reminder that this moment of global celebration began with two men willing to see each other as human beings rather than enemies. The Oslo process teaches us that sometimes the most important negotiations happen not in marble halls, but in borrowed cottages, not between officials, but between individuals who have decided to trust first and verify later. The yellow pad diplomacy of those secret sessions reminds us that peace often begins with the simple act of listening, really listening, to someone you've been taught to hate. Years later, as the Oslo Accords face criticism and challenge, As violence returns and hopes dim, those original yellow pages remain in Norwegian archives, testament to a moment when the impossible seemed possible, when enemies became partners, when two peoples glimpsed a future where their children might play together instead of learning to fear each other. The miracle of Oslo lies not in its perfect success, for no peace is perfect, but in its proof that human beings can choose to write a different story than the one they've inherited, one conversation at a time. As our journey through these quiet victories draws to a close, we find ourselves in the present moment, where the ancient art of letter writing meets the digital age in unexpected ways. Today's peace architects face new challenges: encrypted messages that can be hacked, social media that amplifies anger, artificial intelligence that can mimic human compassion but cannot truly feel it. Yet in this hyper-connected world, the handwritten letter has found new power precisely because it demands something our technology cannot replicate: patience. Syrian ceasefire envoy Staffan de Mistura discovered this truth during the darkest days of that nation's civil war. Rebel commanders, paranoid about digital surveillance, refused to accept electronic communications from UN mediators. Instead, they insisted on handwritten letters, each page signed in ink and scanned by phone rather than sent as digital files. The rebels trusted the deliberate slowness of pen on paper, believing that anyone willing to write by hand must be sincere in their intentions. This revival of analog diplomacy spreads to unlikely places. In Rome, the community of Sant'Egidio continues its patient work, now mediating between South Sudanese factions. Their letters travel sealed with candle wax, bearing the community's dove emblem, each envelope a small ceremony of hope. In 2024, their handwritten protocols on humanitarian access yield 8 separate agreements, proof that in our rush toward digital efficiency, we may have forgotten the power of deliberate, thoughtful correspondence. High in the Himalayas, Indian and Pakistani retired generals meet in a Nepalese monastery, free from the surveillance networks that monitor every electronic communication between their nations. They exchange position papers written on monastery letterhead, their words blessed by monks who understand that peace requires sacred attention. Their 2025 memo proposing pre-notified cyber exercises gains quiet traction in official Delhi-Islamabad dialogue, another example of how back-channel penmanship continues to pave roads to understanding. Picture these modern peace architects, working not in gleaming conference centers but in borrowed cottages and mountain retreats, their most important tools, not laptops or smartphones, but fountain pens and patient hearts. They understand what their predecessors knew, that the act of writing by hand creates a different relationship with words. When you must form each letter individually, when you cannot simply delete and retype, you choose your words more carefully. You invest more of yourself in every sentence. The neuroscientists tell us that handwriting activates different parts of the brain than typing, creating neural pathways linked to reflection and empathy. Perhaps this explains why Kennedy and Khrushchev's handwritten marginalia proved more powerful than their typed speeches, why Bertha von Suttner's ink-stained letters moved Nobel more than any public petition could have. But the future of diplomatic letters faces challenges our predecessors never imagined. Climate change creates new conflicts requiring new mediations. Cyber warfare blurs the lines between peace and war. Artificial intelligence can now generate convincing diplomatic language, raising profound questions about authenticity and trust. In this landscape, the handwritten letter becomes not just a tool of communication, but an act of resistance against the dehumanization of diplomacy. Yet there's hope in the most unexpected places. Young peace activists, raised on social media, discover the power of handwritten advocacy. Palestinian and Israeli teenagers exchange letters through international programs. Their careful cursive building bridges their governments cannot. Colombian former guerrillas write apology letters to victims' families, each page a step toward reconciliation. As we look toward tomorrow, we see that the essential ingredients of peace remain unchanged. It still requires someone brave enough to write the first letter, someone humble enough to read the reply with an open heart, someone patient enough to continue the correspondence even when hope seems lost. The tools may evolve from quill to fountain pen to smartphone stylus, but the fundamental act remains the same, one human being reaching across the divide to say, "I see you, I hear you, let us find a way forward together." In the end, every letter in our journey has carried the same message, written in different ink but bearing the same truth, that peace is not the absence of conflict but the presence of understanding, not the silencing of disagreement but the commitment to keep talking, keep writing, keep believing that words can triumph over weapons. So as you settle into sleep tonight, dear listener, carry with you the knowledge that somewhere in the world someone is sitting at a desk choosing their words as carefully as a gardener tends their roses, writing letters that may one day stop wars, save lives, and remind us all of our shared humanity. In a world that often feels divided beyond repair, these quiet architects continue their patient work, proving with every page that hope, like ink, flows wherever human hearts are brave enough to let it. The letters that brought peace remind us that the most powerful revolutions happen not with violence, but with vulnerability, not with weapons, but with words, not with conquest, but with correspondence. They light the way toward a tomorrow where our children might inherit not the hatreds of the past, but the hope of pages yet to be written, stories yet to be told, peace yet to be made, one letter at a time,